Some serpents slither silently, so some seem super sinister. But the others who represent the other half of that concept are not given their due, which is why in today's entry of the NeverDex, we're going to be giving the floor to a unique pair of common-offs whom we've seen in my previous videos. Ross the Rattler has had more than his fair share of complications in his life, most of which come from a lack of understanding and compassion from others, but a few special individuals have helped make this young snake come to terms with who he is and have inspired him to make a difference in others. And one of those special entities is the girl of whom he wears the ring of, Dainty Naomi Mousette, Ross's unlikely common-off. In Neverscapian culture, it is very uncommon for certain pairings to coalesce, but does not make it impossible. In the Petaliaverse Neverzone, there have been friendships, alliances, mentorships, and common-off unions that have defied the laws of earthly logic. Dexter the Never Spider and her little sister Churro each were in love with the grasshopper species of Never beings, and Princess Snow Tiger Saul had a non-physical union of love with her common-off Firefox, a literal flower with the soul of a pixie and fae. In essence, Dainty's desire to be with the serpent who saved her life stems from her mother's unusual chimera genus. So before we get to Ross, let's explain the concept of the chimera gene and the history of Dainty's family. Dainty and her siblings, Demuria, Farina, Stardancer, Whisper, and Dane, were each born to parents of different species via their mother, Delicate Mousette, who herself was half mouse and half raccoon. Often when couples of different species mate and have children, the child only inherits the dominant genes of one species if there's a significant difference between the two. In Della's case, she was born with her father's raccoon tail and her mother's mouse anatomy. With her daughters and son, this was not the case, but they each carried the peptide in their genes that allowed for compatibility between species mating, explaining away the clutch of 8 children that Demuria had with her common-off Baxter B, a count of the Never Hive. But more on that in another video. The moral to the story that applies to this topic is that, like Demuria, Dainty was already open-minded about sharing her life with another of a different animal species. With some extreme exceptions, most Never beings are born with the potential to be either good or bad equally, even those of a predatory nature. Ross was of a more passive and lighthearted personality, and as such was an outlier for most of his life. Living in Serpent Canyon was akin to living in a drunken frat house or a prison with no bars, as one's freedom was determined by how ruthless they were. Everything was always a contest of guts and gory glory. In effect, they were not that different from the wasps or the quiliads. This was not an environment where Ross thrived in, so he had to learn to roleplay and use illusory tactics to fool his snake brethren, and for some of the time it worked. About the time he was 14, Ross decided to try his luck away from the northern canyons, making his way to the Neverwoods, but one thing he had not counted on was the cold atmosphere of the magical forest, which did not mix well with his already cold blood. Ross was too deep into the forest to try to find help without leaving the one patch of warmth he had found near a grove of fruits, and he could not go back the way he came, for fear of what might wait for him with the other serpents. For weeks, Ross had stayed in that section of the woods, barely getting any sunlight from the canopy above, and not having the nerve to reveal himself to any of the passerby. Fate would take a very unlikely turn when a winged creature with sharp talons accidentally landed on him, causing him to screech out loud in pain. The loud caw of the other creature had terrified Ross enough that he found a rush of adrenaline to propel himself underground and run away. The rate at which he drilled through the ground had the repercussion of dropping out into empty space and a 1,000-foot drop on the hard stone. He slipped right through the hole like a torpedo, but was saved mid-air by a familiar set of talons, this time clutching the circumference of his body as tightly and as gently as possible. In an Australian accent, the winged creature asked Ross if he was okay. Far from it. Ross passed out, fearing that he was on the menu of this creature. Hours passed, and Ross eventually woke up, the ground underneath him having been treated with a special serum that the Never tribe had created to warm the ground as a binary compound. The first thing that Ross heard was the sound of claws scratching through the ground as their owner paced back and forth. The avian creature came into the light and asked Ross if he was okay. He was stunned at how she knew his name, much less not recoiling in terror from him. This was a girl who was not afraid of snakes, crocs, bears, lions, tarantulas, or anything else, and she was able to read his emotions with a power of empathy that showed her that he was the furthest thing from a threat. The girl's name was Felidiae Falcone, a Neverscapian falcon, and she was gravely concerned about Ross's condition, seeing as how she viewed herself as the cause of it. Ross shrugged it off. still in utter amazement at her tolerance of him. He did not say anything else, but when he tried to leave, Felidiae advised against it. He did not know his way around, and even if he did find another warm pocket, he'd still be stuck. Also, he was very weak. Ross gave in and asked what the girl wanted from him. She only wanted to help him recover and be fit enough to go back out on his own, and she was willing to do whatever it took to help him. Ross underwent nutritional and physical therapy under Felidiae's direction for a week. He had been inactive for weeks prior to that, and he was still cold. This was all beyond his comprehension, especially the look on her face. In truth, it was not the look on her face that bewildered him, but rather the feeling he had whenever he looked at her. His heart pounded, he sweated, and he was flushed when their eyes met. The final night of his therapy and recovery brought Ross and Felidiae together at the dinner table for a special meal. Ross was shocked when he saw that there were lit candles, flower petals. He had heard stories about these kind of encounters, but he had never witnessed it for himself. The moment his eyes met with hers again, time practically stopped. Ross's red face was staring at another creature with the same degree of blush as his. Felidiae admitted that he did not need the full week to recover. He was stout enough that he could have left on the third day, but she did not want to be apart from him, not ever. Ross could not believe what he just heard. It was the last thing he ever expected to hear, yet, at the same time, it was everything he never realized that he actually wanted. Felidiae was in love with Ross. Somehow, she was in love with a snake, and she could read him like a book. He was no more a threat to her than a blade of grass, and he was as endearing to her as a forest sprite. Let's pause right here for a moment and unhusk the maze of how empathy works in NeverBeings. A telepath can read the thoughts, both vocally and visually, of those that they can tap into. The only thing besides a Marvel Comics helmet that can keep a telepath out of another's mind is the psychic fortitude that the other has. Empathy is a psychic read of another's emotions, not their thoughts. But when the emotions that they detect are positive or neutral, the thoughts of that person can also be read with ease in conjunction. Or in the case of Pan Knights, they can literally teleport themselves into that mind's heart chamber as an electrical impulse translated. In the case of beings with unparalleled malice or evil, you're more likely to see through a wall of solid granite than look through that being's head. Nor can their biosignal be detected. They are in essence cloaked. For most serpents of this Never Zone, that's how they're shielded, even from the strongest of empaths. Benevolent spirits that have what are referred to as maelstrom emotions, extreme frustration, anxiety, depression, devastation, and the like, are only seen as an undiscernible rainstorm. The caster can see that the storm is there, but they cannot detect what the source is unless their skills are extremely fine-tuned. It is true that most Never beings that are evil at heart will be unable to be read empathically without the aid of what are called anti-pirate darts, made from a purple isotope known as Nescomp matter, a psychic byproduct of evil and dark emotions. Injecting the serum into the bloodstream of an evil being will cancel out the Nescomp matter that keeps them undetected, and will make them as easy to read as a fast food placemat. But species alone does not dictate whether a Never being is good or bad, discounting the mermaids of that Never Zone, as they, as a collective, can either be good or bad. It's a universal law. As Ross was always quiet, soft-hearted, and was unable to allow others to come to harm, his emotions were clear and impossible to fake. While it may seem like a cheat, Felidiae could not only sense that Ross was scared of his surroundings, but he was also entranced by the majestic falcon girl who was giving him sanctuary. When she put all her chips on the table, as it were, Felidiae asked Ross if he felt the same way about her as she did for him. Again, he did not answer audibly, but his thoughts did the talking for him. Felidiae and Ross were about to kiss, but then he remembered that he never learned to control the venom he released. She assured him that if he took a breath and relaxed, he could focus and keep his fangs retracted. The first few times they attempted to kiss, Ross was terrified, but he had finally developed the muscle memory to keep his fangs in check, and they eventually shared their first kiss. For nearly 4 Never years, Ross and Felidiae were inseparable. They wanted to take the vow of combination together and start a family down the line, but they were always so happy when they were together it didn't matter at that time. Ross, throughout his cohabitation with Felidiae in Lady Sal's biodome, however, had suffered through horrible nightmares, believing that they were about his toxicity and how it would affect those that he loved. These were non-linear dreams, but he could somehow sense it. Felidiae also began to sense something too, that his thoughts were closing up, and that something was making his emotions maelstromed and violent. It took a lot of prodding, but he eventually said to Felidiae that she was not safe with him unless he went through the most taboo of procedures that a snake could undergo, devenomization. Felidiae was strongly against this. She did not want him to risk his life, just to lower the risk to her, one that she was willing to take a chance with, I might add. Ross decided that he was probably being overcautious and that Felidiae was right. For the next few months, they began to think more and more about their combination ritual, whether or not they should pick out a Magtus flower with Lady Sal's help. Then came the night of the Auroras. It was an event that they had looked forward to for 2 never years. The lights in the sky were predicted to be the most luminous and vibrant of any before seen. Felidiae had their spot picked out near the Never Falls, and Ross had bartered for some of Lady Celestine's specialty gummy worms and Oz's Sarsa tonic from the Never Try PX. The first 10 minutes of the Auroras were spectacular, and the lovebird and love snake were literally feeling the same heartbeats within their chests as the other. All Felidiae could think about was that this was such a special night, one that she would never forget. But then her appetite compelled her to reach in for another wingful of gummy worms. But at the same time, so did Ross. A sharp pain followed. She tried not to scream, but Ross did. He felt a liquid coming from his fangs, and he saw Felidiae trying to suck something out of her wings. Right before she passed out, Ross screamed for help, desperately. He wailed and he screamed. He was in more fear for her life than Felidiae was. No one saw who teleported them to Lady Galatea's clinic in the pitch darkness, but the augmented human began to immediately administer countertoxins and keep Felidiae's fever down. When nothing was working, Ross asked Lady Galatea if she or Lady Sal had any antidotes to rattlesnake venom. When she shook her head no, he asked her how long it would take to synthesize it from his own venom. His fears of Felidiae dying before the cure could be created were put to rest when a voice chanted and echoed, "Phase stasis wave!" and surrounded Felidiae in a green force field, frozen in time. With the help of her brother V combined Silver Dart, Lady Galatea was able to isolate the core components of Ross's toxins and create the right formula to counteract his venom. When Felidiae awoke, she felt reinvigorated and healthier than ever, but the three of them then realized that Ross was missing. He had left while they weren't looking. Even with their combined powers, Ross was now untraceable. 3 weeks of searching finally saw Felidiae in the Never Desert adjacent to the canyon. What awaited her was a balloon and a gift box, and his rattletail sadly sticking out of a hole. Felidiae had been worried sick about Ross, fearing they could have been killed. Ross softly said to himself that he should have died. He couldn't face her. He hated himself for what he had nearly done, by accident no less. Felidiae did not care about the risks. She loved Ross, and she knew that he felt the same way. And he did. To this day, he still does. But it manifested in him setting her free. The box contained a specially made common offering made out of pixie and gold. He pleaded with Felidiae to move on without him, to find someone who would not put her at risk ever again. Felidiae was not going to win this argument this time around, so she tearfully said to Ross, "You'll be in my heart forever, Rossi," then flew off with her one good wing. She took the balloon, but purposefully she left the ring behind. This was the first time that Ross could ever empathically hear the feelings of another on his own. Her emotions said to him that he deserves to be happy just as much as she, that she knows that one day he will find someone worthy of him, and that her love for him will never die, nor their friendship. Ross began to cultivate a severe agoraphobia and refused to leave his hole. That is, until he found himself back in Sal's biodome again. No, this time he wasn't teleported there. He was brought there by a speed demon quicker than the eye. Her name was Chase, a Neverscapian roadrunner who was good friends with Felidiae's inner circle. Felidiae had filed an injunction with Lady Sal on Ross's behalf, which could be construed as committing him, but instead of a sanitarium, he was put under the Nevertribian's care in paradise. Ross felt lonely again, and he only had himself to blame. So on a mere whim, he put on the ring the Felidiae had given back to him. Once he had it on, he could practically feel her fluffy wings around him once again, gently caressing him ethereally. It was the sort of comfort that he truly needed, and that he truly desired. This got him thinking that he could not live without love, but that he could also not live with anyone he cared about so long as he posed a threat to them. Ross begged Lady Sal to speak to Lady Galatea, her Commandant, and see about him being drained of his venom and his glands removed permanently. Seeing this as a cry for help, and that he was sincere, Sal promised that she would speak to Taya about it, but that he would have to think long and hard about it and for at least a nevermonth before that. So she released him back into the custody of his mother and half-brothers, Rosie, Raoul, and Ricardo Rattler. Surprisingly, Ross was welcomed back with open coils by his family, them believing he had been exploring the island and making a name for himself. Ross went with the lie, but Rosie knew better. After her stepsons had left, Rosie begged Ross to tell her what was really going on. He was shocked when he could, for the first time, actually empathically engage his mother. She had no malice or bile or bigotry about her, and he finally felt safe. Ross spilled about everything that had happened in the last 5 never years, that he was in love with a falcon, and that he nearly killed her by accident, and now he was faced with considering the ultimate taboo to snakes. He needed his rest from the long trip, so he was taken back to his old room, still as he left it, and slept the entire night. The following morning, there was a stranger at the breakfast table, a stranger to Ross at least. This was an elderly rattlesnake who was Rosie's brother v combined, which meant he was Ross's paternal uncle, Fangs. The old man was a recluse because he was deemed unfit to live amongst their kind because he, too, voluntarily relinquished his venom and glands. Fangs was a pacifist, and even though he was married to a cobra girl, he never wanted to be the cause for another being's demise. Kelly the cobra, his commandant, was also a recluse because she was in love with and combined with him, so she was exiled by association, but was still loved by Ross's father and mother. Ross asked his uncle if he was happy as a devenom serpent. Fangs didn't say a word, but his emotions were conveyed to Ross mentally. There was nothing about Serpent Canyon that he missed. He and Kelly lived in paradise on the other side of the island, in peace. But they had no kids because they were afraid of what their world would treat him as, and that was one of the biggest regrets that he and Kelly ever had. Ross had a month to think about whether he should go through with it or not. Fangs reiterated to him what Lady Sal said the risks would be, and that he might not even come out of it alive. But it was Ross's choice. And he made sure that he knew that neither Fangs, Kelly, Rosie, or even his brothers would ever write him off the way they did Fangs. During his time back at home, Ross began to branch out and interact with the snakes that he knew from childhood, and he saw that nothing had changed, and that he had to play along if he was to survive amongst them, just like old times. For 2 weeks, they went on the hunt for prey and for treasure, the latter of which Ross had more than been pulling his weight over, but they were fed up that he had not caught any live prey, and even worse, he turned away whenever they did. His manhood was essentially at stake as far as they were concerned, but then, the sounds of a mouse squeaking above the canyon had arrested their attention. They dared Ross to race up there and give it the what for. But to them, that meant, what spices will you pick out for this little morsel? Tired of their goading and taunting, Ross slithered up the hill as fast and as stealthily as he could. Then he chased after the mouse into the stone labyrinth, also known as the Walls of No Return, where many snakes cornered and had their daily meal. The head start that Ross had against the others was at least 4 minutes, and he hoped that that would be enough. The mouse sobbed into her knees. She was terrified to death, but this just happened to be her luckiest day of all time, because Ross whispered for her to dig her way out while he created a distraction. The ground was soft enough that it could be moved. She was caught off guard, but she then realized he was being serious. He instructed her to dig diagonally in a southerly direction. It would take her to the secret passage to the most safest part of Lady Sal's biodome, where she would be protected from. He had only learned about this for the past few months, and he put it to good use. Still, the mouse hesitated as Ross created a wall around them. Time was running short, and he began to become frantic. He begged for her to dig, and to get to safety. She then began to dig like a maniac, faster than Ross could even predict. She peeked back out for just a second and tearfully blew Ross a kiss, thanking him for what he did. Right as the hole closed, Ross could hear the other serpents catching up to him. Ross lowered his wall and faked the sound of snarfing and munching. And pretended that the blood-soaked soil that the mouse had stood on was her remains. He had pulled off the charade perfectly, and inside he was laughing, while at the same time, he had this pining feeling in his heart, one that he couldn't explain. A few nights later, Ross was awakened by a dark figure. Ross frantically tried to scream, but the figure had muffled him. The voice of the invader had come to warn Ross that if he harmed one hair of her sister's head, he would not live to see his skin shed ever again. She asked if he understood, and went, he did. While Ross struggled to catch his breath, the mysterious figure's paws reached for her mask and hood, but not before tenderly stroking his muzzle as a way to calm him down. The glow of her eyes vanished as her aura turned a passionate blue. Ross saw a photo negative of the girl who in essence stole his heart. He almost thought this was her.
My name is the Myriad,
she squeaked softly.
My sister Dainty wants to thank you in person. I just wanted to be sure that what I sensed from you was real,
she said. When Ross asked if it was, she only replied,
No, more so. Meet her in the biodome tomorrow, and just FYI, she loves chocolate-covered cheese.
The following night found Ross at the rendezvous point that the mysterious figure had given him. The only thing Ross had to barter with was his ring, but he was still willing to part with it, giving it to the human behind the counter in exchange for a big box of chocolate-covered cheese, and the supplicant never coins that it was worth in exchange. The white mouse had made it, and she had found Ross frozen in fear, like he was an elephant. Dainty confessed that she truly felt that her last dying breaths were going to be above the blood-soaked ground that she was cornered in. But ever since she fled from him in the tunnels, she could not stop thinking about him, and the kiss that she blew for him, it was because she felt the good in him. She could literally see it with her figurative third eye. Even after hearing all of this, Ross still couldn't move. Dainty took out a small box from her backpack and pleaded with Ross to open it, and when he opened the lid, he couldn't believe it. It was the gold ring that he had bartered with earlier that evening. Some would say it was love at first sight, and Ross and Dainty were two of them. Dainty slipped the gold ring back onto Ross's tail, where she knew it belonged, and she said that she did not care if he was toxic or not. To her, he was a hero, and he obviously cared about her as well, very deeply. That's why she was willing to barter with some of her things that she liked, so that she could give this to someone that she loved. If he was to be trusted with Dainty's life, he honestly believed that he could not handle it, not the way he was. Dainty told him that she was not afraid, and that after everything he did to save her that day, she believed in him 100%, maybe even more. The rest of the night, they got to know each other, munching on some other treats that Dainty had brought from the Never Tried PX and the chocolate cheese that Ross had brought for her. They found out they had so much in common. It was not a coincidence. It was destiny. Ross could not hide the fact that he was in love again, but he also felt that this was just more justification to undergo the devenoming. When Lady Sal went over to check up on them and see how things were going, Ross pleaded with her to have Galatea do the procedure, no matter what the risk. Sal set up the date, but she still assured him that the risks outweighed the reward in some respects. Dainty knew of a Never being that Sal did not, and encouraged Ross to speak with her before making his final decision. It was right before his appointment with Lady Galatea when Dainty brought Ross to visit Pitalia, a wildflower who lived at the edge of the Neverwoods, out of view of humans. Pitalia made a show out of it by putting on a spider silk pharmacist costume, doctor's outfit, and play acting a Swiss accent and using her leaf as a pad of paper. Ross sat on a magic construct shaped as a doctor's couch and talked out his troubles with Pitalia. Everything they experienced with his first love, what he had learned about from his uncle, and how badly he wanted to keep Dainty safe while at the same time unable to let go of his previous love. All of it came pouring out of him. What Pitalia felt about the procedure was of little consequence, but she felt that if it was what Ross truly felt was necessary, she would stand by his choice and help out in any way that she could. On the day of his appointment, Ross and Dainty received a surprise guest who offered her services as a cellist to aid in Ross's comfort throughout the procedure. Ross was unsure at first, but Dainty's smile indicated that she could be trusted. This was Cello Hopper de Scorch, one of Dainty's best friends growing up, someone who Pitalia knew very well also. Ross had stated to her in the session that his biggest fear was they would wake up during the surgery and feel the pain of everything that was happening. Sure enough, during the operation, Lady Galatea and Lord Sylvadartan were successfully able to remove his venom glands and replace them with faux glands that constantly gave out magic that aided his immune system, and his excess venom was drained, all while he was asleep. When Ross woke up, he was re-energized from Cello's music, and when he tried to squeeze venom out of his fangs, he failed. He was never so happy, and right then and there in the recovery room, Ross pleaded with Dainty to get the gold ring that Lady Sal promised to hold on to while Galatea and Sulphur operated on him. She brought it over and asked if he wanted it back on his tail. He shook his head and asked Lady Sal if she had a piece of string or a chain. With a happy smirk, Lady Sal happily complied and anticipated what he wanted next, and correctly guessing, Sal placed the gold ring around Dainty's neck. Ross, with unnerving confidence he never had before, declared his love for Dainty and asked if she would be his combinant. As if to answer him, Dainty hugged him, narrowly missing the sutures and nearly hurting him. Her eyes shed happy tears, and one of them happened to land on Ross's scar, which healed the surface that it touched on contact, making it disappear completely in that one little spot. Sal had seen this many times before, but each time always felt like the first. Dainty's tears of love were real and they were magic, and so was the level of emotion that they stemmed from. They hugged some more, and Dainty's joy and tears kept shedding, which elevated Ross's own emotions and made him release tears that were just as loving as hers. Her tears healed the rest of his scar, while his tears cast a light rainbowed aura around them. They left for the biodome with Lady Sal, now officially combinants-to-be. Dainty had shared the good news with her sisters Demuria and Whisper, and to her brother Dane the Weasel and stepbrother Jules Gerbil. Ross was invited to Dainty's father's warren so that he and his combinant Gina Gerbil could meet the new beau. Like with so many combinants-to-be, Ross was so nervous and terrified, but Demuria had spilled the details of everything that had to do with Ross and Dainty, and Dane was a witness to Demuria's test, as he was there in Ross's room that night with her. There Ross was, in a home full of rodents, a serpent's dream, as they were in his kind's delicacy of choice. But he was so meek and docile that he was afraid to even wrinkle the couch cushions. Demuria knew better than almost anyone that Ross actually felt at home with them, and that he would sooner harm himself before even thinking of dreaming, of imagining, of thinking of dreaming, of accidentally harming any of them. Dainty's friend Magnolia had her doubts, but Pitalia swore by Ross, so she was easy to convince. Sadly, as Ross had feared, there was at least one creature on the island that not only protested Dainty's union to him, but that he was even within the same breathing space as her. This particular never being was Juniper Squirrel, a member of the Fae Forces. For this part of the story, visit my NeverDex video pertaining to Juniper Squirrel and her combinant, Will Scott Caribou. Ross and Dainty had opted for a simple non-Magtus combinant ceremony, but Dainty's mind was changed when she had a secret heart-to-heart with family friend Felidiae Falcone. Felidiae shared that Ross was his own worst enemy, and that even with his venom drained, he still would not allow himself to be free of his own burdens unless he was proven to be absolutely trustworthy in her eyes. This gave Dainty an idea, and Felidiae and her combinant Chase set up a special combination ritual at Ritual Rock. Lords Dajanotan Sol and Sylvadartan Sol presided over the festivities, while Sal and Celestin helped Tanya with Dainty's dress. Dainty and Ross gave their vows, but Ross was not told that certain individuals scattered throughout the island were psionically tuned in, so as to witness what was about to happen. At Dajanotan's signal, Ross was to close his eyes and open his mouth. Ross refused. He couldn't do it. He could clearly see what was about to happen, and he wanted no part of it. Dainty pleaded with Ross. If he truly loved her as deeply as he does, he would do it. It took all of his willpower, but he finally complied. The Lords cast a skin-tight face shield around Dainty, giving her a window of time where she was safe from his stomach acids. The next step was for Ross to swallow his ring. Again, it was the oddest request, but Ross once again complied. Reluctantly, Ross opened his maw, and Dainty took off her shoes and walked into his mouth, going down his esophagus, through his stomach, and to the tip of his tail. She then quietly walked back out with the ring, and the face shields that covered both her and the ring had vanished. Ross was exasperated. He was too terrified to even breathe, let alone make any sudden moves. The shielding was not completely acid-proof, and if he had accidentally reflexively swallowed, she could have died. He then realized what they had done. This was not the real Dainty. It was just a doppelclone that she was remotely controlling. He tapped the head 3 times, which would ordinarily be the trigger to disengage it. But it didn't. It couldn't. This was not a hoax. She was indeed the real Dainty Naomi Mousette Rattler, and she just risked her life just to prove to Ross that he is a protector and not a predator. The Never-Tribians and those who were in attendance applauded and cheered for the new couple as they kissed. Juniper, Magnolia, and Felidiae flew in formation with rainbow energy surrounding them, creating patterns in the sky to celebrate such a wonderful pairing in lieu of Amagdus's light. The couple began their barefoot walk in the park as a common-off pair by finding a burrow of their own in the biodome and exploring the island together. The difficult part of this journey was that those they passed that did not recoil in fear of Ross were ready to kill him when they saw him kiss her, because they believed that he was going to eat her right then and there. Dainty urged Ross to continue, but when she saw the look on his face, one of anguish, the same look that Felidiae had warned her about. They headed back to the burrow, but Ross was not allowed to bury his head in the sand anymore. He was ready to face his problems head-on, and Pitalia was the never being to do so. Dainty would go with Ross to every session. It eventually came to a head when a slow loris named Boris sought out Ross and asked him for advice, as he too had toxins that kept him apart from the rest of his community. Ross brought him and a friend named Petros the Platypus to speak with him and Pitalia, counseling them through their troubles. As this was at best a temporary fix to their problems, Ross agreed to help Pitalia counsel them on a trial basis. Then a funny thing happened. Word had spread of this new support group, those who had toxins of their own and personalities similar to Ross and Petros and Boris. By virtue of the love that he was accorded by so many, Ross had found himself in a position where he was able to do good for others who had been in his metaphorical shoes. Thus came the formation of Toxanon. And that's the history of Ross and Dainty, the most unlikely couple in the entire Great Myriad. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. For further information about my characters, go to jonesisterscomic.home.blog and hit the character bio tab in the menu. We're always looking for new topics to do videos on, so if you wish to learn more about any of the characters on my blog, please share in the comments whom you would like me to profile, and I'll do what I can. Transform and fly out.